So, the Hundred Years' War. It's called that because marketing is important, even in history. It actually lasted 116 years, but I guess the slightly longer than a century kerfuffle didn't have the same ring to it. The whole thing started because of a family tree so complicated it would make a genealogist weep. Basically, King Charles IV of France died in 1328 without a son. His closest male relative was his nephew, Edward III, who just happened to be the King of England. The French nobility looked at this English king and said, "Non." They invoked something called Salic law, a dusty old rule they basically found in the national attic, which said the crown couldn't pass through a female line. This was wonderfully convenient because Edward's claim came through his mother, Isabella. So they gave the crown to Charles's cousin, Philip VI. Edward, for his part, was busy with Scotland and just sort of went, "Fine, whatever," for a while. A decision that, like most moments of brief sanity in this story, was not destined to last. Things escalated, as they do when massive egos and feudal obligations are involved. Philip VI started hassling Edward's territory in Gascony, a chunk of France that England still owned. It was the medieval equivalent of constantly parking in your neighbor's driveway. In response, Edward decided to get serious about that whole King of France thing. His first big move was the Battle of Sluys in 1340. This wasn't a land battle, it was a naval traffic jam. The French chained their ships together in a harbor, creating a massive, immobile wooden target. The English, armed with longbows and a basic understanding of physics, sailed in and annihilated them. It was less a battle and more a large-scale archery practice. This gave England control of the English Channel, making it dramatically easier to continue this terrible idea for the next century. 6 years later, at Crécy, we see why Sluys was such a big deal. Edward III landed an army in France for a grand tour of pillaging and burning, a tactic charmingly called a chevauchée. The French finally cornered him. The French plan was simple. Thousands of heavily armored nobles on giant horses charging uphill into mud against a prepared defensive position. A truly flawless strategy. The English had the longbow. It wasn't magic, it was just a big piece of yew wood that could shoot arrows capable of punching through plate armor. The French knights charged, again and again and again, into a sky black with arrows. They were slaughtered. It was a stunning demonstration that a well-trained peasant with a stick could kill a nobleman who had spent his entire life training for this exact moment. The social order was officially on notice. Just as humanity was getting into the swing of being awful to each other, nature decided to show everyone what real devastation looked like. In 1347, the Black Death arrived in Europe. This was not a minor interruption. The plague didn't care if you were English or French, noble or peasant. It swept through the continent, killing somewhere between 30 and 50% of the population. Entire villages vanished. The war, for a little while, just stopped. Not out of any sense of decency, but because there weren't enough living people to fight it. For all their posturing and strategy, the kings and knights had managed to kill thousands. The bubonic plague killed tens of millions without breaking a sweat. It was a humbling lesson in scale that absolutely no one learned from. Once the plague got bored and moved on, the war resumed with gusto. Leading the English charge was Edward III's son, also named Edward, but known as the Black Prince. Probably for his black armor, but also because his military strategy was just bleak.
He perfected the chevauchée, turning it from a simple raid into an economic weapon of mass destruction. The goal wasn't to conquer land, but to burn it, to destroy crops, and terrorize the population so badly they'd lose faith in their own king. His 1355 campaign was a masterwork of this, a 3,000-mile loop of pure destruction through southern France. This culminated in one of the most brutal acts of the war, the 1370 sack of Limoges, where his troops massacred around 3,000 civilians. This wasn't chivalry, it was organized cruelty on an industrial scale, all to make a political point.
A year after the Black Prince's destructive tour, the French decided they'd had enough and confronted him at Poitiers in 1356, and it went just like Crécy. The French nobility, having learned precisely nothing, charged a prepared English position and was systematically dismantled by longbowmen. But this time, the English got the grand prize. King John II of France himself was captured. This was a national catastrophe. England demanded a ransom of 3 million gold crowns, an amount so ludicrously large it was double France's entire annual revenue. The resulting Treaty of Bretagne in 1360 was a humiliation. England got a huge chunk of France outright, and Edward III agreed to renounce his claim to the throne in exchange for the cash. France was bankrupt, broken, and leaderless. A stunning victory for England that would solve everything forever. Spoilers, it didn't. While the nobles were busy playing their expensive war games, the people paying for it all with their blood and grain were reaching a breaking point. In 1358, the French peasantry exploded in a revolt called the Jacquerie. Years of war taxes, plague, and marauding mercenaries had pushed them over the edge. They rose up, attacking castles and killing nobles with a fury born of pure desperation. It was disorganized, brutal, and utterly doomed. The nobility, for all their infighting, quickly united to crush the one thing they feared more than each other, an armed and angry populace. The suppression was savage. Thousands of peasants were slaughtered. It was a stark reminder of who this war was really for and who it was really against. England had its own version, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, for many of the same reasons. Turns out, crushing your tax base is not a sustainable model for government. Who knew? After King John died in honorable captivity in London because he couldn't pay his own ransom, his son, Charles V, took over. And he did something truly radical. He used his brain. Charles, nicknamed the Wise, understood that trying to beat the English in a pitched battle was a spectacularly bad idea. So he just didn't. He appointed a brilliant but gritty constable named Bertrand de Guesclin, a man who preferred winning to looking heroic. Their strategy was to avoid major battles entirely. They relied on skirmishes, sieges, and guerrilla tactics. They'd harass the English, cut off their supplies, and retake castles one by one while the English chevauchés marched harmlessly through empty countryside. It was slow, unglamorous, and incredibly effective. By the time Charles V died in 1380, the English had been pushed back to a few coastal cities. France had quietly won back almost everything. The war was nearly over. And then France was handed Charles VI, who was, to put it mildly,
unwell. In 1392, he had his first major psychotic break, killing 4 of his own men in a fit of paranoia. For the rest of his life, he suffered from bouts of madness where he'd forget his own name or, famously, believe he was made of glass and refuse to let people touch him. Governing France became impossible. The kingdom fractured into a brutal civil war between 2 factions of nobles vying for control, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. They were so busy murdering each other that they completely ignored the simmering threat across the Channel. France descended into chaos, essentially gift-wrapping an opportunity for an ambitious English king to come over and restart the whole pointless mess. And wouldn't you know it, one just happened to be available.
That ambitious king was Henry V. He saw the French Civil War and basically thought, it's free real estate. He revived Edward III's old claim to the throne and invaded France in 1415. After a long siege at Harfleur, his army was ravaged by dysentery and exhaustion. He tried to limp back to English-held territory. But a massive French army, temporarily united, blocked his path at a place called Agincourt. The French had a huge numerical advantage, but the field was a sea of mud after heavy rain. They decided, once again, that the best plan was a head-on cavalry charge by heavily armored knights. Through the mud, into a hail of longbow arrows. It was Crécy and Poitiers all over again, but somehow dumber. Thousands of French nobles were killed or captured. It was a catastrophe that decapitated the French leadership and proved that some people will never, ever learn from history, especially if there's a chance for glory. With the French nobility in shambles and their king still thinking he was made of glass, Henry V had a free hand. He partnered with the Burgundian faction, who were happy to sell out their country to get one over on their Armagnac rivals. The result was the 1420 Treaty of Troyes. This document is a masterpiece of political absurdity. It disinherited the French king's own son, the Dauphin Charles, and named Henry V as the regent and heir to the French throne. Henry even married Charles VI's daughter, Catherine, to seal the deal. So, the King of England was now legally set to inherit France. It was the ultimate victory, except for 2 small problems. Henry V promptly died of dysentery 2 years later, and the disinherited Dauphin, along with half of France, refused to accept the treaty. The war wasn't over, it had just entered its most bizarre phase. The English and their Burgundian allies controlled the north of France, including Paris. The Dauphin controlled the south. The war was a grim stalemate. And then things got strange. In 1429, a teenage peasant girl from a tiny village showed up at the Dauphin's court. Her name was Joan of Arc. She claimed she was hearing voices from God telling her to drive the English out of France and see the Dauphin crowned king. In any normal situation, she would have been laughed out of the room. But things were so desperate that Charles figured, what have we got to lose? He gave her an army, and she started winning. She lifted the critical siege of Orleans, a massive morale booster. Her presence seemed to electrify the demoralized French forces. It was an absolutely inexplicable turn of events that historians still debate. Was she a military genius, a charismatic icon, divinely inspired? Whatever she was, it worked. The tide, impossibly, began to turn. Joan's career was meteoric and short. She was captured by the Burgundians, sold to the English, and executed for heresy in 1431. The English thought that would be the end of it. They were wrong. She had become a martyr, a symbol of French resistance. The momentum was now entirely with the French. The Duke of Burgundy abandoned the English and reconciled with Charles VII, who was now officially King of France. More importantly, the French army professionalized.
They stopped relying on feudal nobles and started building a standing army with standardized pay. And they embraced a new toy: cannons. Suddenly, the stone walls of English-held castles that had stood for decades could be knocked down in a matter of weeks. The final battle at Castillon in 1453 was the polar opposite of Agincourt. The English charged a fortified French camp and were annihilated by artillery fire. It was a fitting, technological end to a war that started with armored knights on horseback.
So, after 116 years of plague, famine, massacres, and continent-wide destruction, what was the result? England, after bankrupting itself and suffering staggering losses, was left with only the port of Calais. They had lost everything else they had fought for. Their humiliation and instability spiraled directly into their own 30-year civil war, the Wars of the Roses. France, though victorious, was a wreck. Its population was halved, its land was scarred, and its nobility had been decimated several times over. But it did emerge as a more centralized state with a strong national identity forged in opposition to the English. So, hundreds, thousands, maybe millions dead, all for a dynastic squabble that ended with the borders looking almost exactly like they did before, just with everyone poorer and more miserable. It's a spectacular testament to the human ability to commit to a terrible idea long after it has stopped making any sense at all. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, nerds!